Pedro Alonso Lopez, the monster of the Andes, just might be the world's most prolific serial killer. Lopez was the son of a Colombian prostitute who tossed him out in the streets at age 8, where he reportedly suffered sexual assaults from a man who took him in. Lopez vowed to do to girls what had been done to him. In the 1970s, he turned into an international predator, roaming across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru in search of vulnerable prepubescent girls. In 1980, after a river overflowed its banks near the mountain town of Ambato in central Ecuador, 4 makeshift graves were uncovered, and the bodies of some of Lopez's victims floated free. Not long afterward, Lopez was cornered by a street vendor and her neighbors as he tried to abduct yet another potential victim, the vendor's 11-year-old daughter. In prison, Lopez confessed to an undercover investigator posing as an inmate and provided details about where victims were buried. That enabled police to unearth 57 bodies. The actual death toll may have been much higher. According to Colin Wilson's and Donald Seaman's book, The Serial Killers, A Study in the Psychology of Violence, while in custody, Lopez admitted to having killed about 360 girls. In 1981, Lopez pled guilty to 57 murders, but because of Ecuador's laws, he only received a 16-year sentence, which provoked public outrage. Eventually, he was released after just 14 years and deported to Colombia, where authorities tried to prosecute him for a murder from 2 decades before. Instead, though, he was declared insane and spent several years in a Colombian mental institution before being released in 1998. Soon after, he vanished, and his current whereabouts are unknown. Luis Gavarito. Colombian serial killer Luis Garavito, dubbed the Beast, reportedly liked to dress up in disguise, sometimes as a beggar or a disabled person, other times as a monk or an official from a charitable foundation, so that he could stalk impoverished children. After he talked his victims into going for a walk with him, he sexually abused them and slit their throats. Police first issued an arrest warrant for Gavarito in 1996 for the murder of a child, but he managed to elude them for several years, until they arrested a man named Pedro Pechuga on suspicion of rape and matched him to photographs of Gavarito. After 6 months in prison, he confessed to killing 140 children over a 5-year period. After receiving a 40-year sentence for the murder of 111 children, he admitted to 50 other killings as well. In 2011, a Colombian newspaper obtained the results of a prison psychological examination in which Garavito was asked why he had killed so many. His reply, "I felt pleasure, even though when I had killed, the guilt came over me." Some experts put the number of children he killed as high as 300. Garavito reportedly was treated at a hospital for leukemia and then returned to prison in 2021, where he died in 2023. Harold Shipman. Shipman was a trusted, respected physician in England who treated more than 3,000 patients in his career. But underneath that conventional image, the father of 4 was a drug addict with multiple convictions who somehow managed to keep practicing medicine. Shipman also harbored a secret urge to kill women, which he satisfied by making house calls to elderly female patients and giving them lethal injections of the opiate diamorphine. Most of his victims were found sitting in their living rooms, as if they had died quietly of natural causes. After authorities grew suspicious and exhumed bodies to test them, Shipman was arrested in 1998. 2 years later, a British court convicted him of 15 murders, making him the most prolific serial killer in that nation's history. A later investigation linked him to a total of 215 deaths. Why he killed so many people remains a mystery. Prosecutors portrayed him as an arrogant man who considered himself intellectually superior to others and who reveled in the sense of power that he got from taking lives. He was very definitely not doing it for excitement, far from it, said forensic psychologist Dr. Richard Badcock in a BBC report. He was doing it mainly to try and resolve something within himself, to get rid of an anxiety, but an anxiety which he might not even have let himself think about. In 2004, Shipman hanged himself in his jail cell. Javed Iqbal. Iqbal, a middle-aged resident of a working-class neighborhood in Lahore, Pakistan, wrote a letter in 1999 to police in which he claimed to have sexually abused and murdered 100 young runaways between the ages of 6 and 16 in a year's time. When police searched his house, they found the mutilated remains of at least 2 of his victims, along with bags of clothing and photographs of boys. Police and families of missing children were able to identify numerous victims from that evidence. After a month-long police manhunt, he was arrested at the offices of a Pakistani newspaper, where he had gone to write out a confession because he feared that police would kill him. Iqbal said that he had committed the killings in revenge for brutal mistreatment that he claimed to have received from the police during a previous arrest. Iqbal had a nihilistic streak. "I hate this world. I am not ashamed of my action, and I am ready to die," he reportedly told the staff at the newspaper office. "I have no regrets. I killed 100 children." In addition to his confession, authorities also found a 32-page diary in which Iqbal had recorded his crimes. Oddly, Iqbal later tried to recant his confession and claimed that he had invented the story to highlight the problem of runaways. The judge wasn't convinced and, in an unusual move, sentenced him to be strangled 100 times and to have his body cut into pieces and dissolved in acid, as he had done to his victims. Before the execution could be carried out, Iqbal and an accomplice, who also had been convicted in the case, were found hanged to death in their prison cells in 2001. Jail officials concluded that the prisoners had committed suicide, but the bodies showed mysterious signs of other injuries. Gary Ridgway. In the 1980s and 1990s, investigators struggled to catch the infamous Green River Killer, who preyed upon prostitutes and teenage runaways in King County in Washington state. The killer would strangle his victims while having sex with them and then dump their bodies in remote areas near the Green River. Police suspected a truck body painter named Gary Ridgway for years, but they couldn't make a case against him until DNA advances enabled them to link him to some of the victims in 2001. To avoid the death penalty, Ridgway confessed to 48 of the murders in 2003 and received multiple life sentences. In 2011, a 49th body was found and linked to Ridgway, who received yet another life sentence. Since then, Ridgway has confessed to many additional killings. ABC News reported in 2013 that he claimed a body count of 75 to 80. He said that he had become religious and wanted to bring closure to the victims' families. In October 2022, the New York Times reported that King County detectives are still working to identify Ridgway's victims. Yang Xinhai. Yang, a migrant worker, may have been the most prolific killer in the history of China, with a body count of 67 murders in addition to 23 rapes. As BBC News reported in 2000, Yang's 3-year killing spree ranged across the provinces of Henan, Anhui, Shandong, and Hebei. He used a hammer to kill and sometimes murdered entire families. In an interview shown on Chinese television after his trial, Yang said that he was a misfit who simply enjoyed committing murders. "When I killed people, I had a desire to kill more. This inspired me to kill more. I don't care whether they deserve to live or not. It is none of my concern," Yang said. "I have no desire to be part of society. Society is not my concern." Chinese police finally got lucky, catching Yang when they detained him during a routine inspection of entertainment venues. After he confessed to the crimes, his trial only lasted an hour before he was found guilty in 2004. A few weeks after the verdict, Chinese state media announced that Yang had been executed, though it didn't detail the method used. Randy Kraft. In the 1970s and early 1980s, Kraft, a bland-looking computer consultant with an IQ of 129, picked up hitchhikers and plied them with drugged beer so that he could torture, sexually abuse, and kill them, before dumping their bodies on freeway ramps. He was caught when he was stopped by California Highway Patrol officers on a freeway in 1983. Inside Kraft's Toyota, the officers discovered a dying young Marine, a hitchhiker whom Kraft had picked up and drugged. Also in his car, investigators found what apparently was a coded list of victims. At his Long Beach home, they further discovered snapshots that he had taken of them, as well as a collection of their possessions, trophies of his murders. At Kraft's trial, his lawyers unsuccessfully argued that his violent acts were caused by brain damage. In 1989, a jury convicted him of 16 murders, and after prosecutors introduced evidence that his total victims numbered 65 or more, he was sentenced to death. Decades later, Kraft is still on death row as his case makes its way through the appeals process. H. Holmes. In the late 1800s, Holmes scammed insurance companies to pay for his medical degree, essentially taking out insurance policies on cadavers. During the 1880s, he worked as a pharmacist in Chicago, where his access to drugs and his propensity for crime allowed him to earn money to open the Castle in 1893. The Castle was where Holmes carried out murders, dissections, and acts of brutality as he continued to defraud insurance companies with bodies of people who stayed at the site. Castle residents weren't Holmes's only victims, however. After his partner, Benjamin Pitezel, was found dead in 1894, Holmes collected a $10,000 payout from the Fidelity Mutual Life Association. An investigation led the insurance company to doubt the claim, and Holmes fled to Boston. He was arrested while there, but it wasn't for insurance fraud or murder. Rather, Holmes was detained by Boston police and a Pinkerton detective for larceny of one horse. Once in captivity, Holmes was put on trial for Pitezel's murder. Holmes was convicted and sentenced to death, but before his execution, he confessed to 27 murders. He received a hefty sum from Hearst newspapers for his statement, however, and the number of people he killed remains unclear. Holmes was hanged on May 7, 1896. Andrei Chikatilo. A native of what is now Ukraine, Andrei, the maniac Chikatilo, endured a difficult childhood during the 1930s and 1940s. He and his family survived the famine years caused by Soviet leader Joseph Stalin's ill-conceived agricultural policies, as well as the brutal invasion by the Germans during World War II. Chikatilo also reportedly suffered from congenital problems that caused him genital and urinary tract problems throughout his life. But none of that fully explains the mental illness that drove him to murder 6 women, whom he befriended at train stations and bus stops, and then lured into wooded areas where he would rape and mutilate them with a knife. Sometimes he cut their eyes out or ate pieces of their bodies. All this while working first as a school teacher and then as a traveling factory clerk. Police arrested Chikatilo in 1984, but were unable to make the charges stick. He had a rare condition that caused the blood type in his blood to differ from the type in other bodily fluids, like semen. DNA techniques at the time could not have determined this. He finally was caught again in 1990 and confessed to 56 murders, though police could only verify 53 of them. Chikatilo said he did these heinous acts for sexual gratification. At this trial, he behaved bizarrely, at times singing and talking gibberish, and even exposed himself to people in the courtroom. In 1992, he was convicted and in 1994 executed with a gunshot to the back of the head. Ted Bundy. From 1973 to 1978, Bundy murdered at least 30 women. Bundy's modus operandi was to lure female victims into his Volkswagen, sometimes by pretending that he'd been injured in an accident and needed their help. Once inside, he would pull out a crowbar and knock them unconscious, then rape them before beating and strangling them to death. He liked to kill his victims under the light of a bright moon or in the illumination of his car's headlights. After a failed abduction attempt in 1974, he was arrested in Utah and convicted of aggravated kidnapping and attempted murder. But while being transferred to Colorado to face murder charges there, he escaped from a courthouse library and went to Florida. While there, he broke into a college sorority house, attacked 4 women students, and beat 2 of them to death before breaking into a nearby home and beating another woman who fortunately survived. Bundy committed 1 more murder, kidnapping and killing a 12-year-old girl, before he was caught. He was executed in 1989. Who did I forget?